In the last video, we looked at the addition and subtraction properties of equality. In this one, we're going to focus on multiplication and division properties, which are very similar to the ones we learned about in the last video. So I'm going to pick up the pace on this one. Let's start with this multiplication property of equality. Notice we start with A equals B, and then we just multiply a C onto there. Don't forget that when you don't see that anything between them, that this is the same thing as A times C equals B times C. So even though we don't write that multiplication symbol, it is implied. Next, the division property of equality. If we start with A equals B, then we can divide a C from each of them and it stays equal. One thing you have to watch out for though, C can never equal 0 or else this is not true. Next, the inverse property of multiplication. This does as if you start with a value A, if you multiply it by its inverse, which is 1 over A, sometimes that's called a reciprocal, then you can see if you multiply that together, you are going to get A over A, and that equals 1. Another way of thinking about this is the inverse property is also when you divide a number by itself, it equals 1. So it's just another way of thinking about it. Next, we have the identity property of multiplication. This is just the one that says whenever you multiply 1 to anything, you get that anything back. This is a very powerful tool in mathematics. It seems ridiculously simple, but it's a rule that gets overlooked a lot, and it really is a very useful rule. The associative property of multiplication, notice the A and the B are in the parentheses in the left side, but now the B and the C are in parentheses on the right side of the equal. This is the one that says we're allowed to move the parentheses around as long as we have multiplication only. If I had addition or subtraction here, we couldn't apply this rule. And finally, the commutative property of multiplication. This is the one that just says that that can be flipped around. So for example, 3 times 2 is equal to 2 times 3. In our example, we're going to list all of the steps or properties that are used. So let's take a look at what we've got. We've got 7 times 3x. 3x is in the parentheses equals 84. So what's missing? 7, 3x. And then notice we've got here 7 blank x. 7, 3x, 7 blank x. Yes, we're missing that 3. Now, notice the only thing that changed from this step to that step. Everything else looks the same. I did add this little dot in the middle, but it's not, it was always there. We just didn't write it. So the only thing that's changed is the placement of the parentheses, and that is the associative property. Just here's another way to help you remember. The associative property is about the grouping symbol, the parentheses, groups. Associations are groups of people. In the next step, we are just going to simplify. So the 7 times 3 is 21. This next step isn't very obvious. I didn't give you a lot to go on, but this is actually a fraction bar here. We're going to divide both sides by 21, and that is that property says is the division property of equality. If we divide the 21 from one side, we must divide it from the other. And then 21 divided by 21. This is going to be this rule right here. We can see it right here, and that's going to equal 1. So I'm going to place a 1 here. And once again, that was the inverse property. In the next rule, we're going to get 1 times x would just give me x. So whenever we multiply 1 to a value, that is the identity property. A times 1 equals A. 1 times x equals x. And our final step is to divide. So I get that x equals 4, and that is just simplifying. So there's no rule or property there. We just simplified. The final property we're going to talk about is the distributive property. On our first page, we had this example. We had 7 times 10 minus 3, and that ended up being 49. But we could also rewrite this. Instead of doing the subtraction first, we can rewrite that as 7 times 10 minus 7 times 3. This is known as distributing because we gave the 7, we multiplied the 7 to both terms inside the parentheses. We distributed it. That's what this distributive property is all about. Now, it's not a great method for doing with numeric expressions because with numbers, it's easier to follow the order of operations. But when we start getting with variables, since we can't do anything with variables, we don't know their value, this becomes a very handy tool. All right, these last 4 examples, I'm actually going to put into our Associative on either Thursday or Friday. So try these 4 examples on your own, and then I'll have them ready for you on our Associative, and we'll see how you did.